Hi, my name is Joseph Milholland, and today I'll be discussing the book Reframing Organizations by Lee Bowman and Terrence Steele. And in particular, I'll be talking about part 2, which is the structural frame, and part 3, which is the human resources frame. But first, before I do that, I'd like to talk for just a bit about the introduction to the book and how it introduces these two frames and the other four frames that are the subject of the first half of the book. And these four frames, none of them can exist alone. None of them is the correct answer in all circumstances. But basically, they are different mental models that allow people who manage organizations or simply just work in organizations to better understand how the organizations operate. And what makes these mental models and managing organizations interesting is how different it is from, say, finance. In finance, you learn a list of rules A, B, C, which essentially attempt to make your money go from 1, 2, 3. It's very logical. It's very ordered. It's based on numbers, and the goal is to increase the amount of money you earn and decrease the amount of money you spend. And in a certain way, managing people can be looked at that way. If you're a business, you want to spend as little as possible on money or on people. You want to spend as little as possible on people while also getting as much money out of them as you can. But at the start of the class, we were introduced to this guy named Peter Drucker, and he flipped that entirely on his head. He said successful management isn't based on money, it's based on people. And his whole point, and the whole point of these mental models, are to reverse our typical expectations, and to, instead of going from ABC, we go from ZYX, or we just go in a pattern that can't be understood through a mathematical formula or a logical analysis. And I think that's best demonstrated by an article he wrote, which for the Harvard Business Review, which was titled "What Businesses Can Learn from Nonprofits." And in the video we watched in this class, someone who was talking about that article said that people thought it was a typo. People thought it was what nonprofits can learn from businesses. But in fact, Drucker was interested in nonprofits because they don't pay their employees at all. So the question for managing nonprofits with volunteers isn't how much should I pay my workers to get the most out of them. It's how should I manage people and get them to work for me if their salary is zero, if they don't make any money at all. So this is kind of what business management teaches us how to do, and these four frames are different lenses we can look at managing people, and they give us a different set of tools we can use. Hey, let's get started with the structural frame. The structural frame is all about how we place people in an organization. What kind of roles, and responsibilities do we give people? And how much authority do we give people? And what kind of tasks are they doing day to day? This might seem like the most basic part of an organization, but when you think about it, there's almost an unlimited amount of ways you can place people in an organization. And to kind of get a broad overview of how this works, there are basically two spectrums of different types of organizational models that are present in this chapter. And the first model is a spectrum between integration and differentiation. Very highly integrated organizations means people work very closely together. Everyone is dependent on everyone else, and basically person-to-person interactions and group-to-group interactions dictates how the organization is run. On the other hand, very highly differentiated organizations are very specialized. Individuals and groups have a lot of autonomy. They make their own rules and they set their own working conditions. There's not necessarily much interaction between these different parts of the organization. And the other spectrum is a spectrum of vertical organization to lateral organization. Vertical organization is top-down rules, management decisions, hiring and firing by leaders, whereas lateral organization is things like meetings or group discussions, things like a Excel matrix where things are where the parts of the organization are very well organized, but there's not an exact hierarchy between them. And the two examples the book gives at the end of this chapter is Harvard and McDonald's. McDonald's is there, it's very tightly integrated and it's very vertically organized. So if you're a burger flipper in McDonald's, your job is dependent on the whole team that is assembling that burger and also the people who are taking orders from customers. So that's a very integrated work environment. But your minute-to-minute operations are dictated by the McDonald's corporate office, and you don't really have any role or ability to experiment on that plan they have for you. In contrast, the Harvard professors, they basically set their own courses, they set their own research, they have incredible amounts of freedom and independence, and they don't work a lot with each other. They, faculty meetings, people sometimes just don't even attend them their whole career. So it's a very differentiated organization. And also, the president of Harvard, he can't really dictate what Harvard professors do or say or teach in their classes. There's a lot of equality. It's very much a laterally organized and a very differentiated organization. So I hope that helps explain Chapter 3. Hey, so let's turn to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is all about how things can go wrong in structures, and then also how structures can be reformed and improved. So, to start, the chapter begins with a few basic structural dilemmas that relate to the spectrums I was just talking about. It's how organizations can be too tight and have too many regulations and too much red tape and too many moving parts working together that it gets too complicated and slows down, but also can be too loose where there's not enough policies are in place, nobody's sure who is doing what, there isn't clear lines of communication. But then the chapter turns to an important part of the structural frame that I really want to focus on, and that's Henry Mintzberg's fives. And what this is basically a model of organizations that Henry Mintzberg pioneered, and he showed how you can divide organizations into 5 parts. At the top is the strategic apex. These are the executive decision makers and basically the overseers and highest authority in the organization who give orders and set out the rules and the constitution of the organization. Then at the bottom, you have the operating core. These are basically the money generators in a for-profit business. These are the people who work with clients and customers. They're the people who do the essential functions of what that organization is set up to do. And then you have, between the strategic apex and the operating core, you have a middle line of administrators who connect the operating core with the strategic apex. In between them, there are two more groups of people. There are the technostructure of technical specialists, people who analyze the money and the activities of the organization in order to prepare for the future or improve efficiency. And on the other side, you have the support staff, people who do essential functions to support everyone else in the business or organization, people like bus drivers or janitors or food service providers. And Henry Mintzberg's frame basically gives you a really interesting way to look at an organization. And this connects to what we discussed in class about the story of Joseph. Joseph, he was this Egyptian, he was this Jewish tribesman who he was abandoned by his family, and he went to Egypt, and he met the Pharaoh, and basically he gave the Pharaoh advice on how to plan his agriculture. So Joseph, he wasn't the one giving the orders, but at the same time, he wasn't the one who was sowing the grain. He was the first technical expert who was consulting for the Pharaoh. And this story really shows you how organizations can be complicated and expanded upon by people who aren't necessarily in positions of direct authority or who are making the organization run, but through their intellect or through their persuasive role can be critical to how an organization runs. And that's the essential idea I want to elaborate on from this chapter. Okay, let's turn to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is all about teams. What are teams? Well, teams, they're small organizations. Technically, a whole organization can be one team, but typically the teams we're focused on are organizations within organizations. They're small, tightly knit groups of people who are focused on a specific sub-purpose within the larger organization. The example that starts the chapter are the SEAL teams, the small Marine groups that do special missions within the larger U.S. military. And there isn't necessarily one hard and fast rule for teams. They even show a number of ways that teams of only 5 people can be organized, from a very hierarchical organization where there's one team lead who gives orders to the other 4 team members, to very egalitarian 5-person teams where each team member has a specific role, but they interact with each other as needed, and there isn't one giving orders to the others. They just work cohesively. There's also an interesting section that describes different sports teams. For example, baseball players on the field, they're very differentiated, they're very individuated. They work independently of one another, and they're almost lonely. But football players are very grouped and organized. They're very tactical. They spend most of their training and most of their playing rehearsing and undergoing very organized and well well tuned tactical formations and plays. But the sports team I want to focus on are basketball players, because basketball players, they're also very well organized, but they're not following a set pattern. They're not really so much tactical in the sense of a planned formation. They improvise. The book compares them to improvisational jazz. Basketball players are so tightly integrated that they almost have this. They need an instinctual sense of what everyone is doing and what each player should do to make the whole team work at any given moment. And I think that really is underlies the importance of teamwork. And it needs to come from a place of deep trust and deep knowledge between all team members. And there's one more thing we should emphasize about teamwork, and that's the team's relationship to the overall organization. There needs to be a set amount of independence of the team from the organization. The SEAL team can't follow the same rules. They can't do the same practices as the overall military. They need to be kind of cordoned off from the rest. But at the same time, there needs to be some integration, some communication between the whole organization and the small team. At the end of the chapter, there's an example of Saturn, which was this specialized team within General Motors in the 80s. And Saturn, they had a lot of autonomy, and they came up with some good ideas. But unfortunately, because General Motors didn't adapt its whole structure to accommodate Saturn, Saturn failed because all their good ideas couldn't get through the rigid structure of General Motors. So independent teams themselves aren't a panacea for organizational problems. Independent teams need to be understood as part of the total structure of an organization. So let's turn to the human resources frame. And like with the structural frame, let's begin by discussing failures of human resources in organizations. Specifically, there's historically been two major ways in which businesses have failed to adequately address the human resources of their employees. And the first, the one we associate with the past and the industrial age, is they've essentially treated their workers as robots who they could mechanically program to be as efficient and automated as possible. Think of like 19th century factory workers who were given really large quotas and not really given any space to experiment or to take breaks. And this is something we see continuing pretty much even today. People who work for McDonald's or some factory workers today who do the same repetitive task over and over again for 8+ hours, and usually they don't make great wages, and their human needs aren't respected. But then there's the other failure, and that's a failure we associate more with companies today, and that can basically be described as contingency. Contingency is when your employees aren't actually full employees. They're essential to the job, and they probably work full time, but they're only on contracts. They're given minimal benefits. They're not really respected as central to the organization. You can see this a lot with university professors who, instead of getting tenure-track jobs, are given adjunct positions that pay a very small salary, and they're maybe teaching 3 classes a semester, but they're not full-time employees. They're adjunct laborers, and these adjunct laborers might do a huge amount of work for the university, and it might be their only source of income, but they're this kind of weird underclass that isn't respected by the university. So, why are these failures so bad? Well, the way the book approaches it, and it's a way I agree with, is that they fail to meet what are called human needs. And the need, as the book describes it, is a predisposition to perform some experiences over others. So, a need is what we instinctually gravitate to or gravitate away from. And there are different psychological theories of needs, but basically, as humans, we develop an independence and a personality, and if our needs are suppressed within an organization, no matter how good the pay is or how great on paper the job looks, eventually we'll come away from that job unhappy and unsatisfied. And yeah, there's also lots of examples of organizations that put human needs at their forefront and have gotten great results. So, how can we better accommodate needs? Well, we'll explore that in the next chapter. Let's turn to chapter 7 about improving human resource management. Now, the book gives a lot of different methods by which human resource management can be improved. But I want to focus on an overall theme I see in this advice, and that's the importance of retaining and elevating employees. So, first of all, retaining employees. If people are quitting after a year or 18 months, then that indicates something is going wrong with how people are being managed in the organization. It might just be they're not being paid enough, but also might be they're not being respected. They're not getting enough opportunities for improvement or advancement. And I think, in fact, getting employees who can move up the ladder, gain experience and knowledge of that specific organization they're a part of, and basically grow their skills around the organization, so there's a kind of a natural symbiosis between that individual's expertise and the needs of that organization is really critical for having human resource management done right. But it's not just about elevating certain very successful employees within an organization. It's about making sure there's a voice for all employees, that the needs and concerns of all employees are heard, that they're given a voice within the organization, and I think the authors honestly kind of downplay a really critical way in which this can be done, and that's labor unions. I think because this book is intended for managers at business schools, they want to give examples of successful companies with happy employees that don't have big critical labor unions. But realistically and historically, labor unions have been kind of the key for making employees happy and satisfied. Labor unions allow for a kind of a certain level of democratic and employee-centric management within organizations. They allow for collective bargaining. That's their key feature, where all employees can get together and basically argue with management about what they need in their employment contracts, what they specifically need in writing to make their jobs better. So, honestly, I think if anything, managers should encourage labor unions because ultimately I don't see how a lot of for-profit enterprises in this country in the future will really succeed at meeting their goals in society if they don't have at least some form of labor unions. But ultimately, it's not up to the management to decide about labor unions. It's the employees who make the decision. So some of the other examples the book gives are important as well. We conclude with Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is all about interpersonal conflict. Now, this is a big subject, and I could honestly probably talk about it for half an hour, but I want to focus on two specific examples I've come across that I think illuminate the theme of this chapter. The theme of this chapter, it basically divides approaches to interpersonal relationship into two models. Model one is adversarial, where you assume you're right and someone else is wrong, and you try to bring that person who's wrong to your side. And by contrast, model two is collaborative. It seeks to find common ground and approach conflict constructively. So my first example of how this can be put in practice is sales representatives. And, if you think of sales representatives, you think of like very adversarial, high pressure salespeople who kind of like pressure and coerce and bully you into making the sale. But when I was working in marketing, I learned that there's another approach to doing sales, and that's a very kind of salespeople as service people. The salesperson ultimately tries to understand the needs of the customer and fulfill the needs of the customer as much as that salesperson can. And sometimes that just means giving advice or a small amount of the company's services for absolute free with no strings attached. And this kind of idea of sales, which sees sales as building relationships and the salesperson as helping the customer, I think in the long run is ultimately much more successful for sales. And the other example I wanted to bring up is it's kind of an interesting pathway, but it's from the work of Peter Rollins, who was a guy, he grew up in the Troubles, Northern Ireland, where there was, a lot of feuds and violence between, Protestant and Catholic groups. And as he was growing up, Peter Rollins became interested in evangelical Christianity as kind of a way to remove himself from that sectarian conflict. But as he grew older, Rollins he approached evangelicism from a different way. He became not an evangelist who tried to convince others of Christianity and convert others to Christianity. Instead, he went to people and tried to become converted to their religion. It was kind of a reverse evangelicism. And I like that example because it shows the power of flipping things on their head when you're dealing with conflict. If you don't just try and see it from your opponent's point of view, you just try to take the whole situation and turn it into a completely different situation. And think it's almost a fundamental skill for conflict resolution that you have this kind of negative capability where you can see things from a completely opposite point of view. And that really connects to this whole idea about inversions and opposites that I began this video with. And I want to conclude with a quote from Sigmund Freud. I found it in a book by Diana Hume George. And Freud's quote is, "Opposition is not necessarily enmity. It is merely misused and made an occasion for enmity." Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned a lot.